right, and we back with another episode of Hey, I'm Just Asking. Now, today we want to talk about Bumpy Ellsworth Johnson, the real story. Now, when it comes to the black gangsters of the underworld, Bumpy Johnson's story is my favorite for two reasons. A black man going against the mafia is insane. Bumpy demanded respect in a time where none was given. Black was fighting for civil rights, and Bumpy Johnson was fighting for Harlem. The Godfather. His story is mysterious though. There's not a lot of information on Bumpy Johnson. I wonder why he's left out of the history books. Bump was a different type of gangster, a made man amongst made men, the only one of his kind to be respected by the mob families without working for them. And since this is titled Bumpy Johnson, the real story, before I start, let's dispel the myths about Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson never sold heroin. Did he get it cut? He's the Godfather, so you play the play or you can relocate. Did he smuggle cocaine? Yes, he did. At a time when cocaine was thought to be unprofitable because of the price tag, high risk, low rewards, it's not addictive, and it's a rich man's drug, there's no lane. Bumpy Johnson saw the future. He had a lane. Entertainers, musicians, black Hollywood, white Hollywood. Bumpy Johnson is one of the forefathers when we talk about cocaine. It's sad to say, but hey, the truth is the truth. Bumpy used this tactic to cut the mob out, a new moneymaker. He bet on himself to become self-made. Bump created the blueprint for a drug that is still relevant to this day. Let's talk Malcolm X. Now, did Bumpy Johnson go against the mafia and the Nation of Islam for Malcolm X? The answer is no. Malcolm X didn't allow anyone to take on his problems. He refused help from a lot of heavy hitters in New York. So let's talk about the last lie, Frank Lucas. Now, if you let Frank Lucas tell it, he was Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man, his enforcer, a protege / driver. This story was fiction, but it was thoroughly executed so perfectly. Frank Lucas used this narrative to become a YouTube star after the success of American Gangster, a movie made about Frank Lucas' life back in his heyday. Did he know Bumpy Johnson? Bumpy took a liking to Frank, so he gave him odd jobs, something like an errand boy. But hey, you got to start somewhere, right? So Frank Lucas started with Bumpy and became king. How did he hold his crown down? Hey, that's another blog. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the real story. Man, Bumpy Johnson was born on Halloween, 1905. He grew up poor in Charleston, South Carolina, with 6 siblings in a 3-bedroom house. His father, William Johnson, was a fisherman, and his mother, Margaret Johnson, was a domestic worker. His family was poor but well respected. They attended church on a regular basis. Hey, that was normal back then. Bumpy lived with his father, while Margaret Johnson took care of his sisters in New York. Both of his parents worked hard, and Bumpy followed in their footsteps. Ellsworth Johnson did exceptional in school. At an early age, a young, intelligent kid, above average schmucks in elementary. His school skipped him 2 grades. But in 1915, when Bumpy was about 10 years old, his brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. So his family had to cash out on their house to get his brother out of Dodge. Imagine that around 1915, 1916 in South Carolina, who hates blacks more at that time probably than Mississippi. When Bumpy turned 14, he started making a name for himself. A zero-tolerance temper, Bump stood on business. The women loved him. Pick a flavor, chocolate or vanilla. Bumpy's parents didn't hesitate to save another son. An interracial relationship back then is already a no-no. They still bitter about your brother, so that's suicide. Don't you dare even stare at a white woman. So it's welcome to New York. Johnson was sent to live with his older sister, and the rest is history. It's time to earn. How can I send money back to my family? Bump wanted to work, but his sister suggested school. Education is the ticket. Bumpy Johnson agreed with his sister, so let's give it a try. First day fresh, with a roll of pennies. His sis blessed him with lunch money and a fresh fit. On the way to school, Bumpy walks into a dice game. A new face looking country, the streets gonna test you. This is initiation day. 6 and 8, Junie Finley, I should say. And the kid Nat put the press on Bumpy. What's in your pockets? So Bumpy was like, you don't want to know. The bully of the crew, 6 and 8, took a step further by grabbing Bumpy's arm. Like, let me get that up off you. The situation is getting heated. It's on. A bet broke out. Like, how much you want to bet? Finley was betting on 6 and 8. He gonna punish that boy. I got $2 on him. But the kid Nate bet on Bumpy Johnson. He said, I see something in him. 6 and 8 swung the first punch, but he missed. Bumpy was quick on his feet, so he dodged the first punch and landed one of his own. This punch landed and busted the taller kid's nose. His second punch landed to the head and left 6 and 8 dazed, but still on his feet. Bumpy's third punch, though, it landed and pennies flew everywhere. Bumpy had the roll of pennies in his hand the whole time. But before Bump could finish him off, the police came, so they all ran. They even helped Bumpy to escape and welcome him to the crew. Bumpy never made it to his first day of school. He quit school altogether and started his life of crime. With his new street family, it was time to earn. They became a close-knit bunch to the very end, shooting craps, selling newspapers, hustling pool games, anything to earn a few coins. One day, a diner owner offered them free meals to sweep up around the place. Bumpy was the brains of the crew, so he organized a plan to sweep as many stores as they could until a new grocery store opened up. And Bumpy offered protection. Him and his crew started establishing their turf around the neighborhood. There's only one problem. This turf belonged to the original godfather of Harlem, Bub Hewlett. Bub made his bones by fighting against the Irish mob in the early 1900s. Once Bub defeated the mob, he started offering protection to the speakeasies, the pimps, pushers, gamblers, and business owners. When Bub heard about the new store opening, he went to the owner to offer protection only to find out that Bumpy and his crew had beat him to the punch. Bumpy was bold. He was outside waiting for Bub, leaning on Bub Hewlett's Lincoln. So Bub approached Bumpy like, "Man, get off my car." And Bumpy responded by getting off his car and telling Bub Hewlett, "Hey, get off my block." Bump laughed like, "Your block?" Bumpy was like, "You already got most of Harlem, but this store is ours." Mind you, Bumpy was 16, 5'8", and cocky at the time. But Bub Hewlett was a grown man, 6'1", and stocky with hands of stone. Bub met Bumpy halfway and told him, "Well, just give me a cut and we can be partners." Bumpy agreed to the terms jokingly, and him and Bub became friends, then later enemies. Bumpy Johnson's sister found out about him not going to school, so she was upset. But Bumpy pulled out a wad of cash, $200. He gave her half and sent the other half home to his family in South Carolina. She never complained again about him going to school. Bumpy was making noise in the streets, doing burglaries, floating card and dice games. Bumpy and his crew became solidified in Harlem. Bub Hewlett suggested that Bumpy offer protection to the numbers bankers in Harlem. Now the real money is coming in. One night, Bumpy was protecting a Cuban's numbers runner, Alex Pompez, and a gunman appeared out of nowhere to rob them. Bumpy used his weapon of choice, a switchblade, slicing the gunman across his face while pushing Pompez in the car. The robber dropped the gun, and Bumpy gave him another slash across the stomach. The police heard the commotion and rushed over to arrest Bumpy, but he fought off 3 cops until he was subdued and arrested. Bumpy was charged with attempted murder and resisting arrest, but Pompez got Bump a good lawyer, and Johnson was given a year probation for disorderly conduct. Alex Pompez was a major player in the numbers racket, a self-made millionaire who went on to do big business with the Major League Baseball. But that's another blog. Go do your homework on Alex Pompez. Bumpy Johnson was in high demand, second only to Bub Hewlett. A dice game going wrong brought Bub and Bumpy Johnson even closer. Yellow Charleston started busting off shots after he was refused a loan to continue gambling. This altercation left 2 men deceased, one of Bumpy guys and a good friend of Bub Hewlett. Yellow Charleston had 2 of the illest gangsters in Harlem gunning for him. They caught up with Yellow Charleston, and he was never seen again. Bumpy's name got bigger in Harlem, and this got the attention of one Madame St. Clair, the Queen of Harlem. The madam was impressed by Bumpy's intelligence, so she hired him to be her full-time bodyguard. Bumpy Johnson was in and out of jail for the next 5 years for his burglaries, assaults, and he caught a grand larceny charge. Elmira, Sing Sing, and Alcatraz. Bumpy was no pushover in jail. As a matter of fact, he terrorized the prison system. No warden wanted Bumpy in their facility. He was too much of a problem. While he was on the inside, he heard about Dutch Schultz taking over things in Harlem. The Dutchman hired Bub Hewlett for his muscle. Then he took over the numbers racket. Bumpy couldn't understand Bub working for a Jewish gangster. So when Bump came home, Bub tried to recruit Johnson to work for Schultz as well, but Bumpy declined his offer. He aligned himself with the Queen. He recruited a nice army with heavy artillery and he was set to go to war with Bub and the Dutchman. They took losses on both sides. Schultz's men were easy to target because they stood out like sore thumbs. White men in Harlem? They were no match for Bumpy's crew, but Bub Hewlett and Bumpy had a few shootouts, with both of them being shot, but both of them survived. Bub was locked up later for assaulting a man with a switchblade. This war was bloody, so Bumpy had to pull out his trump card, Charles Lucky Luciano. Bumpy saved Lucky in jail. A thug tried to shake Lucky, but Bump sniffed it out and saved the day. Bumpy pummeled the guy to a pulp, and Luciano never forgot about it. This was later. I just wanted to give y'all a breakdown on the friendship between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano. Lucky didn't want to get involved, but he made an offer for Bumpy to work with him. But Bump once again declined. With Bub Hewlett in jail, Dutch hired a heavy hitter from Chicago, a black hitman, Ulysses Rollin. He put the word out that he's gunning for Bumpy Johnson. So when they met, Bump sliced and diced Rollins and left his eye hanging out of the socket. But Rollins was a different type of tough. He got his bandages and his eye put back in socket, checked out of the hospital, and went looking for Bumpy Johnson again that same night. He caught up with Johnson and let off shots. He shot at Bumpy Johnson but missed. The bullet went through Bump's hat and killed an innocent woman. The cops came and arrested Rollins for the murder. 3 years into the war, and it's getting bloody. Lucky sent one of his goons to visit Dutch. He filled Schultz with lead. Game over. Bumpy Johnson is now the godfather of Harlem. He has the key to the city. His money is no longer good in the clubs, diners, movie theaters. Restaurants wouldn't accept his money. Bumpy Johnson fought for Harlem and won. He's on top of the world. Everything's going great until Lucky wasn't so lucky and got sent away for prostitution. When you're the king, hey, everybody's gunning for your spot. The cops, the crooks, the cons, and the women. Now, with Lucky Luciano gone, it's a void with prostitution in Harlem. Now, Bumpy didn't pimp, but he did protect prostitutes for a fee. Who better to pay for safety than Bumpy Johnson? You drop his name and they'll walk the other way. But not New York Charlie, the gorilla pimp. He's strong-arming, dishing out slaps like, psh, you work for me now. Bumpy ain't no pimp. Man, when Bump found out about New York Charlie, he caught him and gave him the slice buffet. Bumpy was vicious with that blade. The Black Wolverine. Hey, New York Charlie is carved up with cuts bleeding. So he told the cops, yeah, Bumpy Johnson did this to me. Though police spotted Johnson at his favorite spot for dinner, Small's Paradise, they interrupted his meal to arrest him for the assault on New York Charlie. Bump was like, he's lying. It must be a mistake. Let's go to the hospital and ask him. You'll see, Bumpy was thinking Charlie would stick to the code. He was wrong. The cops asked Charlie who did it, but before they could finish, he answered, yeah, that's the MFer that cut me. Man, Bumpy jumped over the table with the doctors and started choking him. The police had to knock Bumpy out with their nightsticks to get Bumpy off of him. He was sentenced to 10 years for assault. He's back in the can. Bumpy Johnson ran every jail he was in, especially on the black side. The Italians needed his help now. Bumpy Johnson has always had a stronghold on the game with protection. Now, remember when I talked about him saving Lucky Luciano? The respect he gained from the Italians after this is legendary. No more mess hall for Chow. Bumpy is eating great. He is at the table with the Italians, now with steaks, pasta, and fried calamari. Something like a scene out of the movie Goodfellas. Bump had a smooth bid, and in 1947, he was released. Bumpy Johnson came home to a surprise party. It's big envelopes of cash. He's back on his feet, at least enough to get him started. Bumpy wants Harlem back, but now the East Side Italians is running Harlem. Here we go again. The Genovese family, Fat Tony Salerno, and one of the most notorious hitters in mafia history, Trigger Mike Coppola. Joe Adonis, the concierge for Lucky Luciano, a close friend of Lucky's, sent word for Bumpy Johnson to meet with him. Adonis and Bumpy met, and Adonis gave Bump $6,000 and a brand new Lincoln on behalf of Lucky Luciano. Bumpy Johnson accepted the gifts, but he told Adonis he preferred a Cadillac. Adonis understood and said, okay, take this for now, and I'll have you a Cadillac in a couple of days. Bumpy then told Joey that he wanted his old spot back. So Joey asked Bumpy, did he get permission? Bumpy responded by saying, I don't need permission for something that's already mine. Joey told Bumpy that he would have to talk to Lucky Luciano and the Genovese family and set up a meeting. So Bumpy Johnson and his crew came to the meeting heavily strapped up, just in case of some funny business going down. He met with Fat Tony to discuss getting his corner back. Fat Tony told Bumpy, I can't give it back to you, but you can work for me and I'll pay you real good. That's the least I can do. Man, I guess that's just the mafia way. They just wanted to have you on the payroll to work for you back in those days. Man, Bumpy refused his offer. Meeting's over. I don't need permission from no one to feed my people. Bumpy politely stepped off, but paused to leave Joey Adonis a message. Hey, Joey, hey, thank you for wasting my time. I'm going to need you to get word back to Lucky of how disappointed I am about today's gathering. Joey responded back saying, hey, Bumpy, you giving me orders now? Bumpy replied, I'm not giving you orders, but I'm definitely not taking any either. When word got back to Luciano, Lucky was furious. He explained to the Italians that Bumpy earned his position. Give him anything he wants, because he has his deal in place with the families, and that agreement will not be broken. Honor the deal, or you'll have to answer to me. Lucky was still calling shots from Italy. Harlem was peaceful at this time. The Italians and black didn't have any problems or beef until the Italians came uptown and snatched a legendary basketball player and coach for the Harlem Globetrotters, Pop Gates. Gates was one of the first black players drafted into the pros. When Bumpy got wind of this, he ordered the mob guys to return Pop back to him. The Italians returned Pop unharmed, but this was the beginning of Bumpy's friends having issues with him and the mafia. 6 and 8 was working with the Italian crew that had him place a bet on a prize fight for $2,000. Instead of 6 and 8 placing a bet like he was ordered to do, he tried to flip the money and bet on the opposing boxer. This was a bad mistake because his fighter lost and now he owed the mafia big money. Bumpy told his friend to skip town or the mafia would kill him. 6 and 8 didn't listen to Bumpy and was later found dead in the middle of the street. This hurt Bumpy, but what could he do? His man was in the wrong. In 1948, Bump was introduced to a guy, Flash Walker, by Pop Gates. Now, Flash was down on his luck, broke, starving, and walking around in the snow with holes in the bottom of his shoes. Bump took a liking to Flash and accepted him into his home with his wife and 2 daughters. Bumpy never had a son, so he became a father figure to Flash. He showed Flash the ropes and hired him as a driver / bodyguard. Sounds like the Frank Lucas story, right? But let me continue. Flash had good boxing skills, but he had a glass jaw. Nobody would fight him back under Bumpy Johnson watch anyway. They became close, so Bumpy put him on to the numbers racket, and Flash became one of his top runners. Flash had the gift of gab, so he could make people spend more money. He's the ultimate salesman. Life is good for Flash now. He's no longer homeless, and he has a great job working for Bumpy Johnson. What more could he ask for, right? Flash started using Bumpy's name around town, cocky and arrogant, feeling like he was untouchable, picking fights with anyone, including police. Bumpy had to save him from being killed in one incident with a cop. He was feeling himself, and that started rubbing the crew and even Bumpy's daughters the wrong way. The crew suggested that Bumpy get rid of Flash before he comes back to haunt you for trusting him so much. The crew was right. Around 1950, a pimp that had did time with Flash was released from jail and came to Flash with a check cashing scheme. They would cash checks from a rich woman's account and use Bumpy's account to clean the money. What was he thinking? That Bumpy wouldn't find out? The scheme was going good though, until Flash and his partner started getting greedy. It went from $200 a week to $800 a week. Wow. They had a 4-month run until the bank questioned Bumpy about the transactions. Bumpy avoided jail time by making a deal with the rich woman's father. But this left Bumpy heated. He went looking for Flash, so he stopped by his house to consult his wife about the situation. He then learned that Flash had been touching his daughters inappropriately, allegedly patting them on the butt. Bumpy was pissed. He caught up with Flash and beat the brakes off of him. Stay away from me and my family or I'll kill you next time. Flash felt ashamed. He had lost the one person that took him in and showed him love. He tried calling Bumpy several times, but Bump would hang up on him every time he heard his voice. A bitter Flash was looking for revenge though. When he got locked up on heroin charges, Flash told the cops he was working for Bumpy. The cops didn't believe him. They knew Bumpy didn't deal drugs, and everybody knew about the beatdown Bumpy had put on Flash for his treachery. The feds stepped in because they wanted Bumpy to snitch on the mafia. But Bumpy didn't fold. He wasn't a rat. Death before dishonor was big back in those days. But as you can also see, there was a lot of co-ops. The cooperators and snitching was going on as well. Bumpy posted bail and took care of business while awaiting his trial date. One night, Bumpy got into an altercation with a drunk pimp, and the pimp shot Bumpy Johnson. And then he skipped town, never to be seen again. This incident delayed the trial for a year. When the trial started, Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years. The feds stacked the deck with lying witnesses. Bumpy tried to even the odds by bribing the judge with $100,000, but his plan failed. Bumpy Johnson appealed his case all the way to the Supreme Court, but his claims went nowhere. Bumpy could have paid a $9,000 fine to be released early, but he refused because he didn't want that drug dealer tag on his name. His wife convinced him to cut out the foolishness, and she also convinced his crew to pay the fine, and Bumpy Johnson was released after serving 10 years in jail. In 1963, Bumpy Johnson went legitimate and started a business that supplied chemicals to exterminators. The godfather of Harlem continued to help people with financial problems. Bumpy even took care of Malcolm X's family after his friend was gunned down at the Autobahn Ballroom in 1965. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson was used to calm down the riots in Harlem after MLK was assassinated. Bumpy would later pass away in 1968 from a heart attack while facing charges from cocaine smuggling. The end of an Earl. This was short but sweet, but I had to give you the real insight on Bumpy Johnson. I don't know, man. Tell me what y'all think about this. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the real story. Man, like this video, share this video, comment, and subscribe. Hey, I'm just asking.